Good afternoon. My name is Mark Hidgley. I'm the provost here at the King's College in New York City, and it's our pleasure to welcome you to this book launch event for Dr. Ben White, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies here at King's. His book is The New Testament in Comparison, Validity, Method, and Purpose in Comparing Traditions. It's coming out from T&T Clark, and it is co-edited by Dr. White and his colleague, Dr. John M.G. Barclay. Dr. White began his role at the King's College in 2018, where he teaches courses in biblical studies and theology with a focus on the New Testament. He holds a PhD from Durham University, where he studied with John Barclay, and his academic work has been presented at major conferences around the world. His thesis, Pain and Paradox, the Transformative Function of Strength in Weakness, is due to be published by the German academic publisher Mohr Siebeck later this year. He's also been a guest editor of the Journal of Theological Interpretation, and last year, Dr. White was named a visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's the proud creator of a course he calls Christianity and the City at the King's College, which uses the Apostle Paul's engagement with cosmopolitan Corinth as a model for understanding the gospel in a modern New York City context. And when he's not teaching or writing, Dr. White enjoys spending time with his wife, Brittany, and his son, Gideon. So please join me in welcoming for his book launch event, Dr. Ben White.
Thank you, Dr. Hidgley, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in this afternoon. It's a privilege to be with you and to discuss this exciting book, The New Testament in Comparison. The topic of the book concerns a fundamental practice of modern New Testament studies, comparisons, specifically comparisons between New Testament documents and other Greco-Roman sources, or comparisons within the New Testament itself. While the New Testament in Comparison is a technical work for Bible scholars, the topic matter indirectly relates to almost everyone and everything. All of us make comparisons. To compare is to be human, as one contributor says in the book. We depend upon comparisons to make sense of ourselves, of others, and of reality. Comparisons are everywhere. From the schoolyard, where children compare their lunches or how far their mother can throw a football, to the lips of Jesus, who says this, "Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you more valuable than they are?" For centuries, New Testament scholars have especially utilized the power of comparison. But these comparisons raise questions which, surprisingly, do not always receive satisfying answers. What is the purpose of comparison? Why should we compare things? How do you do it well? And why does all of this matter for Christians in American society today? These are some of the questions that I'm going to answer this afternoon. My talk has 4 parts. First, an introduction and a bit of a backstory to the book, the purpose of the book and its contents, a brief overview of one of the key debates within the book, the viability of friendship as an alternative paradigm that limits and animates our comparisons, and finally, right at the end, the cultural implications of the book, which are briefly discussed in the book itself, and I'll be expanding upon those towards the end. So if you can't already tell, I'm going to talk about the book on different levels. I'm guessing that we have a mixed audience today with students, faculty, and staff from King's, as well as others in the wider King's community, and perhaps also some New Testament scholars tuning in from outside the King's community. I'll try to give all of you something to think about. First, in order to appreciate the need for a book about comparisons in New Testament scholarship, I need to tell you a bit of a story. We're going to go back in time to the halls of Cambridge University in the mid-19th century. There, a scholar named Joseph Barber Lightfoot attracted large crowds to his lectures on the Bible. The selling point was Lightfoot's vast grasp of classical sources. He weaved in and out of references to Second Corinthians and Second Clement, to Plutarch and to Peter. At that time, most students of theology were used to reading the Bible as a somewhat abstract, doctrinal book. It was invigorating to think about it historically in conversation with the great treatises of the Greek and Roman worlds. The book that fell from heaven was found to have human clothing. While many figures were responsible for this shift in biblical interpretation, Lightfoot is a good figurehead for our purposes because, after a stellar career at Cambridge, he finishes his life as bishop at Durham University, at Durham Cathedral, which is the central building for the campus of Durham University in Northern England. In the decades since Lightfoot's death, much has changed in biblical scholarship, but Durham has only increased its reputation for New Testament scholarship. And it is particularly known for sponsoring PhD projects that are comparative in nature. It was when I was based in Durham a few years ago that the New Testament in comparison began to take shape. In the summer of 2017, at the direction of John Barclay, the co-editor of the volume, I helped to organize a conference which a number of graduate students in Durham had been talking about for some time. Several of them are in fact recognized in the book as the inspiration for the entire project. Specifically, these students felt that in order to make truly original arguments about the New Testament, and therefore to earn a PhD, they needed to put New Testament texts into conversation with other ancient sources. So, for example, rather than simply reading Paul's argument in Romans, and that's it, you could put Paul into conversation with a figure like Philo, an Alexandrian philosopher who was roughly contemporary with Paul, to see how Paul is both similar to Philo and different from him on various topics. This would hopefully lead to a more precise knowledge of Paul's letter to the Romans, its distinctives, what makes it significant. But it's not common in our seminaries and graduate schools to receive any training on how to do comparative projects. And many of us didn't feel that enough conversation was being had about the art of comparison. So, John was instrumental in securing a number of scholars from top institutions around the world, Yale, Cambridge, Chicago, and others, to come to Durham and spend a few lovely English summer days talking, both in the seminar room and over meals, about comparisons. Despite a minor hiccup here and there in the running of the conference, you could maybe ask me later about how the staff of one of our dinner venues removed a crow from the dining area. We had an awesome time. The product of the conference is the book, The New Testament in Comparison, which is mainly the conference contributions, plus a few essays that were commissioned after the fact. There's a good balance throughout the book between theoretical discussion and examples of comparisons. The published reviews that I've seen thus far of the book note that the essays are lively. Well, you should have seen the conference, and I'll say more about how lively that was in just a few minutes. The book specifically looks like this. It was published in T&T Clark's peer review series, the Library of New Testament Studies, hence the recognizable blue, white, and red color scheme. But what about the contents of the book? So let's start to talk about that. Again, it's an edited collection, so the introduction sets the context and the theme, which is then explored in various ways by the book's contributors. John and I begin in the introduction by setting out what we believe to be the basic issues in comparison. I'm going to read those for you here on page 3 and 4 of the book. So we start off the book saying this. Some of the issues that a scholar doing comparisons faces are these. First, choosing what to compare. Let's start with the obvious. The two or more phenomena placed into comparison clearly have to be similar enough to make comparison possible and different enough to make it interesting. Second, selecting for the purpose of comparison. Any comparison is partial it is hardly possible or even useful to compare complete wholes with complete wholes. The necessary selection is in itself a dangerous exercise if it leaves the larger context out of consideration. There is, it seems, an important dialectic between focused selection and the larger contextual horizon of the items selected. Third, categorizing the items compared. To put two items into comparison requires placing them together within a common category or frame, and this third action is necessarily an intellectual, scholarly construct. Fourth, determining the purpose of the comparison. Every comparison has an agenda, and openness and self consciousness about that agenda is always better than the opposite. Finally, measuring degrees of similarity or difference. If no two cultural or religious items are completely similar, some may certainly be more similar than others. It is difficult, however, to give a generalized overall measure of such things, and it may be misleading to do so. So that's the theoretical framework. To make this more concrete, though, let's consider an example from the Gospel of John to see some of these principles in action. The first 5 verses of the Gospel of John read as follows. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In this famous introduction, John does at least 2 things which may suggest some influence from the Hellenistic world. The first is his use of light and darkness imagery, an apparent dualism that seems reminiscent of a Platonic or even Gnostic dualism between this world and the immaterial world. The second is his use of the Greek term logos, meaning word, to describe Jesus. The Stoics use this term to refer to the generative principle of the world, a divine entity. For years, these resonances led New Testament scholars to think that John's gospel is heavily dependent on Greek philosophy. This thesis has since waned considerably because, for example, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid 20th century revealed that a cosmic dualism is native to Jewish sources, not just Greek ones. But if you think carefully about comparisons, as our book asks you to do, you would start to ask questions which further problematize the connection between John and Greek philosophy. We know about the similarities, I just described some of them, but what are the differences between John and other sources? Specifically, how do we conceptualize John's thought? For instance, it seems like the term dualism, often employed to describe ancient philosophies, is being given 2 tasks here: to describe Platonic thinking and to describe John's light and darkness imagery in John chapter 1. But notice verse 5 of that text. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. This isn't a dualism per se, a light versus darkness equation. This is arguably a paradox, 2 contrasting entities, one surrounded and qualified by the other. In John, you can't understand what's happening to the darkness until you see the light that's breaking in. That's exactly what verse 14 says. The Word, Jesus, became flesh and dwelled among us, which is something that many ancient philosophers would struggle to say, if they could say it at all. The Word, the immaterial, controlling power of the universe, became flesh. But that's exactly what this early Christian gospel says about Jesus. This creates a different perspective on John, where rather than borrowing from Hellenistic philosophy, perhaps John is trying to invert some of its concepts in order to communicate the transformative nature of the incarnation. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that thinking about comparisons rightly is the only variable at play here. There are many different readings to be considered for John chapter 1. But I do think this example shows what's at stake. How you compare a New Testament text with some other text, with what you compare it to, can really shape the meaning of the New Testament passage that you're looking at. So you need to be prepared to defend your comparison, be aware of its limitations, and above all, ask good questions. I don't think our book answers all of the questions about comparisons. It certainly couldn't. But that's partly because neither John nor I think that good scholarship necessarily involves giving good answers. This is crucial. Good scholarship merely involves asking good questions. And that's a lot of what this book aims to do for those engaging in the comparative enterprise. But I do want to offer some answers today, and I promised earlier that one of them would be to the question, what is the purpose of comparison? Of course, all of our contributors have their own answer, but the closest to my own is what John says in the second chapter of the book. He quotes the poet Robbie Burns, who says this, and I can't possibly replicate the Scottish brogue, but here we go. Burns says this: "Oh, wad some power the gifty gie us to see ourselves as others see us." In other words, if you heard that, a comparison properly understood gives us a new and sometimes improved vision of ourselves. It acts like a mirror. The irony of life is that by looking at others, we can become more familiar with ourselves. And that line of thinking is proven time and again by scholars who, for example, read about meals in the Greco Roman world to better understand the nature and distinctives of early Christian meals. But as I think the book alludes to, this quest for self understanding is wisdom for all of us. I can remember being in a friendship group some years ago that we jokingly called Academics Anonymous. We were all very young scholars who met to share our hopes and dreams for a life in the academy. While we may have been tempted to view each other as competitors, I think we genuinely hoped for the other person's success. We shared tips, resources, and we talked openly about our self doubt and the possibility of disappointment. In that sense, the comparisons we made between each other were helpful for our self understanding, for reassurance, for knowing what we needed to do next. But they were only helpful because, to use another metaphor from the book, the comparisons were a kind of mutually edifying conversation. This illustrates the heart of the humanities and social sciences, this metaphor of conversation. The goal of getting a humanities education, an education in the arts, is not to rigidly protect your own perspective or your reputation. It's about generously engaging with philosophers, poets, novelists, and other thinkers, no matter their viewpoint, in an effort to understand them and, as a result, to better understand yourself, to work toward the flourishing of society that is built on genuine conversation. But even this metaphor of conversation raises one of the crucial questions of the book. One of the contributors, Kavin Rowe of Duke Divinity School, had released a significant book called One True Life just a year prior to the conference. An unintended dynamic of the conference and subsequently the book was that no less than 4 of our contributors opted to devote a significant amount of time to critiquing Rowe's ideas. Given the weight of these critiques, we opted to give Rowe a chance to respond. And that is why the book has an initial essay from Rowe as well as a response chapter. But why all the fuss? Well, to offer a very brief summary of Rowe's highly nuanced argument, he says that the way people do comparisons today is problematic. He notes that a comparison of 2 bodies of literature must take into account the larger existential narrative of the authors. You can't properly compare, say, Paul and Seneca on self control unless you compare the larger traditions of life which they represent. However, when you go to do that, in this case, comparing Stoicism and Christianity, you'll see that both traditions claim a degree of exclusivity and that their adherents cannot, within such a tradition, properly understand the other. In this sense, the traditions, at least from the perspective of the traditions themselves, are incommensurable. You can only live one life, Rowe would say. So why compare, acting as though you could truly inhabit the life of another? While Rowe doesn't mean to say that you cannot compare Stoicism and Christianity at all, his notion of incommensurability comes across to many readers as dismissive of comparison and of the entire discipline of the humanities. In the words of one of his published reviewers, quote, "If we cannot at least try to understand other philosophies, societies, or religions, what point is there in research? What hope is there for the world?" Rowe certainly does want hope for the world, and his solution is to set comparisons in a different framework: friendship. As Rowe says in our book, and I'm quoting again, friendship does not require theoretical understanding for its practice. Moreover, it aims at truth, not the sort of shared truth that is a product of agreement, but the sort of relational, friendly truth that emerges from truth telling about the conditions that make up our lives. We might speak here of a kind of understanding. We understand one another as friends do, even if the grammars of our traditions remain grammars of conflict and summons. Despite what I think is at times a helpful argument from Rowe, he is accused by some contributors of appealing to friendship to protect Christianity's ideological purity and resist the rigors of the comparative enterprise. The conversation remains unresolved in the book, and it is rare, I think, in a scholarly book like this to have such heated exchanges. But I think that reveals just what is at stake in conversations about comparison. When you move into the larger cultural implications of the book, which are mentioned here and there in the book itself, it becomes clear that how you compare two traditions, and especially how you define the goal of comparison, illuminates how you understand yourself and your relation to your neighbor. Countries have gone to war over less. In our diverse, pluralistic society, I can think of few more important conversations. I remember hearing several years ago about a man who lived in a fairly traditional part of the United States. He had heard that the local library was going to acquire a copy of the Quran and place it in the religion section right next to dozens of copies of the Christian Bible. The man protested to the town council, stating publicly, "We don't want falsehoods in our library, only the truth," by which he meant the Christian Bible. The response came from one of the councilwomen: "Sir, don't you realize that if the Bible really is divine truth, you've got nothing to be afraid of?" I like that response because it reminds us that comparisons as conversation are fundamentally good. We may not be able to fully understand our neighbor, not least in a city like New York, but that shouldn't stop us from having the conversation. At the very least, it may help you to better understand your tradition of life. I think that is one of the takeaways of this book, that as Christians, too often we get upset when Christianity is exposed to open conversation, scrutiny. But that scrutiny should, if we build on a firm foundation, be the very thing that vindicates us. Of course, in a world laden with culture wars, it would be understandable if you expected the person doing the comparisons to be ideologically aligned against Christianity. And that's a fair concern. The heart of all good comparisons is, as I said at the beginning, defining the purpose openly and equitably. But perhaps we also need to own the fact that we don't always compare equitably either. The last thing the world needs from our Christian apologists and culture defenders is a series of strawmen and gotcha arguments about rival traditions. To compare is to be human, you might say, but to compare well requires training and virtue. At the very least, I am encouraged that all of the contributors to our book, The New Testament in Comparison, try to do what so many people refuse to even try: to have the conversation, to make a comparison, to talk about how to do it well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White, for that stimulating journey through your book and your work. We're greatly appreciate what's going on with your studies and your work together collaboratively with these other authors. And so we're going to move into a time now of interview and some questions with another of our fine professors, Dr. Drew Johnson, Associate Professor of Biblical and Theological Studies, who will join the conversation now. And there is a number in your chat if you would like to direct questions to Dr. Johnson as he conducts the interview. Dr. Johnson.
First of all, I want to congratulate you and Dr. Barclay for publishing this book, because I know most people don't know that books like this are actually extremely difficult to publish, mainly because publishers don't want to publish a collection of essays. So the fact that this was actually published is in a high-level series in itself is a testament to the value of the conversation. I also host a podcast where we interview biblical scholars and we ask them all, what do you think the most important work in the last 50 years is? And many of them will cite Dr. John Barclay's work. And so he is a field-shifting thinker in this area. And so I'm so grateful that we get to hear this discussion between all of you, including Kevin the row starter row. So I actually had some questions on deck, but now having heard your talk, I have some slightly different questions that maybe have percolated to my mind. The first one would be this. It seems to me that, I'm asking the hypothetical question. Are Christians who hold to some view of scripture that has it as an authority in their life, are they required to do the comparative work between their own theology and their own kind of philosophical life and the philosophical world of the scripture?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I would say yes. And what I would invoke to defend that view, because I suppose it is a bit contentious, is that when you hear Jesus say something like "love your neighbor," I think we often take that in a very ethical sense and in a very concrete sense. So we think that loving your neighbor means shoveling their driveway when there's lots of snow on it, and you know that they can't do that, or something like that, an act of kindness. But I think those acts of kindness need to extend to the intellectual frame. Loving your neighbor means seeking to understand them. And actually, in the process of understanding them, as I was saying in the talk today, you may end up understanding yourself a bit better too. So yeah, I would say Christians, even just lay people, who aren't trying to write a PhD in New Testament studies or something, it's wise and good. And actually, I think it fulfills what the kingdom of God is meant to be when you try to understand other traditions and place them into conversation with your own.
Even if that other tradition is the biblical tradition.
Yes. Definitely, if it's the biblical tradition.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of Christians would say, well, my tradition is the biblical tradition. And so they see no contrast between their own thoughts and the biblical author's thoughts. But
right.
A good Bible study will help you work that out, right?
Yep. Or our PBI classes.
That's right. Also, the other thing that comes up again and again in biblical comparative studies and biblical literature is, and I saw this a lot with Paul. It always comes with Paul and Stoicism. And you see lots of volumes out there by very brilliant scholars, and they often just walk through what are the parallels. And I think for me, the question is not that there are parallels between Paul and Stoicism, but why there are parallels. And I wonder if that gets addressed by anybody in the book, and what the general consensus is on how do you answer the question, why is Paul parallel to Seneca or Epictetus?
Right, right. Yeah, and this is something I'm often sharing with my New Testament students, is that we often divide between, I'm going to say, sacred history on the one hand and secular history on the other. So it's even, sometimes a bit of work, especially when you're a new student of the Bible, to realize that Paul lived in the Roman world. So we don't have Christians and Romans. The first Christians were Roman, or they at least lived under the rule of the Roman Empire. And so when you're starting to make connections between something you might learn in ancient philosophy about the Stoics and the early Christians, you have to understand that those aren't two worlds that you're then trying to really artificially connect. There's a sense in which it's the exact same world. Paul speaks the same language as many of the ancient Stoics. He writes in the same language. He lived in the same world. He experienced some of the same events. And so that's why there are so many different contact points. And that's why it's important, to think carefully, especially if you're a scholar, about how it is that you do these comparisons, is to be really specific and try to establish why it is that two figures should talk to one another. Because there's the broader conversation about the two worlds. There isn't sacred history and secular history. They're in the same world. But then to be even more specific than that, and try to decide, is this comparison between, say, Paul and Seneca going to yield any fruit? And that's where the book begins to come in helping people ask important questions about similarity and difference and contact points and why you're doing the comparison in the first place.
Oh, that's helpful. I think of issues like even the word, the choice of a term. So in the Hebrew Bible, we have this word Sheol, which means kind of the grave or the place of the dead. And when they're translating that into Greek, they have to think about what's the best term that captures it. And so Hades becomes the kind of go-to term most of the
Right.
time, not just because of the word, but because of the connotations of the place of the dead that come with it. So I guess there's also this question of, well, how do something like Hades, or maybe you have some other examples in mind. You're making comparisons, and the metaphor we use, or the analogy, is apples to apples versus apples to oranges. How do you know when your comparison has turned from an apples to apples to an apples to oranges comparison, when you've gone
Right.
too far?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that to some degree it goes back to one of the initial theoretical touch points that I was talking about at the beginning, is that you need to think really carefully about both similarity and difference, and sort of try to envision how the comparison might play out. So to use a completely different example, someone could sit down and say, I want to compare Jesus's thoughts on the meaning of life with the Buddha's. And initially we might go, oh, that's great. That'd be really interesting. Two major belief systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you could start to pull quotes from these different sources and line them up. But once you start to do that, you begin to realize that actually Jesus and the Buddha literally spoke different languages. They lived at different times. And so even though, because now we have all this knowledge, we have all the documents, we can compare them, we could physically do it, we could intellectually do it, it's only going to work for so long until you realize that the comparison itself is involving a lot of cultural translation and interpretation. And so what I would say is that comparing something like Jesus and the Buddha, not that we're talking about that in the book, but it's just a kind of a clear example.
I've actually seen a paper on this exact topic. So
Well, and people do it all the time.
There
And
you
I think what this book is trying to get at is that you really need to think about whether it's even possible to make that comparison. It seems like eventually it's just going to become your own thinking on Jesus and the Buddha, rather than actually having a real live conversation between them. It's just not possible. But it could be possible, or at least more defensible, if you're dealing with two figures who lived at the same time, who lived in a similar region, who spoke the same language, who used some of the same terminology. Well, then you're getting somewhere, and that seems more plausible.
Yeah. I noticed you used the term incommensurable when you have two two groups of people that live in their own traditions, and in this case, it's mostly the Stoics versus the new Jewish and Roman Christians, and that they might actually be using the same terms, the exact same words, and meaning them in very different ways. Like theos for God is the one that Kevin Rowe kind of homes in on. But they might have incommensurable ideas about what God is or who God is. And that's borrowing from, I assume, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution. But for Kuhn, the scientist who has a revolutionary idea like Albert Einstein, he can convert his colleagues by using metaphors and trying to get them to look over his shoulder and say, do you see what I see here? Yeah. Do you think that Kevin Rowe, because he's the one who really caught fire in this essay, and that issue of incommensurability, does the friendship issue bridge the gap between complete incommensurability and the ability for Paul to convert Epictetus or Seneca as an example, like the possibility of that happening?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and I think Rowe's arguments are misunderstood by a number of people. I think when you get into certain comparisons, like you were saying with Paul and the Stoics, where they could use the same word, but it's no one, I think, is arguing that they have the same God, or at least that they would conceive of it that way. I think it's really important to make a distinction between words and concepts, between what we refer to with what Augustine would say is an arbitrary sign. A word is just a sign that we're using to then point to something in reality. And I think appreciating that difference is something that Rowe actually tries to illuminate really well, is that when you compare two things, it's not enough to simply look at it at a literary level. Look, this ancient source and this ancient source both use the same word for God. Let's compare all those passages. Because eventually what you're going to realize is that those words exist in a larger narrative, a larger tradition of life, which moves in different philosophical and theological directions and ends up pointing to a very different God. And so I think some of the questions that Rowe asks of the comparative enterprise are actually totally legitimate. It's definitely a modernist construct to put two things into comparison with one another and assume there's some kind of neutral ground that they could all meet on, and we could come up with a bunch of data that's helpful. We have to think about the larger rituals, the larger setting in life that animate these terms. And therefore make it sometimes really difficult to compare. I think, though, where the friendship motif runs into trouble is even though it's likable on so many levels, who doesn't like friendship? I think we all want friendship. Where it runs into trouble is that it seems to suggest that you really can't compare at all. And I don't think Rowe is ultimately trying to say that, but it definitely has those connotations. And that's what gets people really upset. As I said in the talk, is it seems to question the very nature of the humanities itself. And I think that's something actually that's an ongoing conversation in the 21st century postmodern world, is we're having to think about the humanities, the way we compare, why we do it, what the goals are.
Yeah, Rowe borrows the notion of the kind of encyclopedias mentality or encyclopedist mentality, the modernism, where everything's kind of, two things can come on a neutral ground, as you say. So I wonder, just in a final question, you as a professor at the King's College, I tend to see students that come in with that kind of an encyclopedist mentality towards the scripture, that it's all kind of equal and everything can be compared to everything else just equally. What are some of the things that you do to help them understand the different traditions and nuances of the biblical text?
Right. Yeah, I think one of them is understanding the different genres of the text, that you can't just start to read the Bible as a set of propositions and it all works equally in the same, and you can put one proposition up against another, because that's not the way it works. When you read a psalm like Psalm 97 or Psalm 23, it's dealing with imagery and with metaphor. And so sometimes there's a certain kind of inherent ambiguity there that requires interpretation. It's not to say that the meaning is entirely opaque. It's just the meaning comes through a process of exegesis, interpretation, understanding the historical context. And so I think the biggest thing is really to emphasize that a conversation is necessary. I love that metaphor. I used it several times. You have to have conversations with each text and begin to understand what they're saying. The heart of reading the Bible is an effort of trying to understand what the text is going through. And so again, a lot of these metaphors come up, right? Conversation, you could also use friendship. You have to give a sympathetic reading of the social position, the literary output of one particular biblical author, do the same for another biblical author, and then you can begin to have a conversation between those two texts. And it's totally legitimate to do that because it's all a part of the canon. It's all a part of sacred literature. But as I said, that metaphor coming out of Joseph Barber Lightfoot's lectures at Cambridge, the book that fell from heaven has human clothing. And so you always have to deal with that tension between the divine nature of Scripture from a Christian perspective and the fact that it is historically conditioned.
Well, Dr. Benjamin White, congratulations again. I love a book like this where it took a very important book and extended the conversation among scholars and then extended the conversation out so everybody else could read what happened in Durham. So thank you very much for doing that service work for the scholarship. And at that, I think we are concluding this book launch. The book is now launched.
Thanks, Dr. White, again for your stimulating presentation. We're looking forward to seeing the future of this book and the rest of your work, and also for Dr. Johnson for leading our discussion today. And thank you all for joining us. Do join us for other events of this kind with our faculty and guests and other scholars. Have a great day.